housing more efficient to how we're going to create jobs that work with a climate resilient future. Underlying that report is two groups. There is a scientific assessment of climate change in Maine, so that recommendations in the plan are science-based, and there are recommendations from an equity subcommittee so that the recommendations in the plan serve all people in Maine. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the key findings in this scientific assessment report. Before we jump in, you might be thinking, whoop, that's my water bottle. Okay, another climate science talk. I could probably give this myself. I show some things that look like, oh no, this. I show some things that look like that, and then I say we're all doomed. I'm going to show a little bit of the type of illustration you see on the left, but I want to offer a little bit of a different framing than the doom. When I was a brand new postdoc at GMRI, I gave a talk in a community about climate change, and the next day an op-ed came out essentially criticizing me for being too hopeful as I was talking. They also criticized the snacks, so I took it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it did make me reflect a little bit. You're like, why am I so hopeful? Sometimes this work is heavy. Turns out there's quite a bit of research on the science of hope, and it turns out it's very tied to action. Essentially, you have hope when you have agency to take action, and when you take action, you feel hope. So these two are tied and both very important. And the process of taking action looks like setting a goal, building knowledge to achieve the goal, and developing a plan. I get to do that all the time in my work around climate science, and Emily talked about an example where I'm working to improve flood forecasting in Maine by installing tide gauges and working with multi-generational community scientists. You all, by being here, are also engaging in this process. So, at bare minimum, you're here building knowledge. And I hope that once you leave today and as you go forward, you will have goals and start developing a plan. So that's all to say, climate change will force us to adapt. There will be challenges, but let's engage in this in an active way, which starts with being here today. So thank you. Okay, this is a 250-page report. Don't worry about reading this whole list. I'm going to come back to it at the end and give you a little bit of homework. But I'm going to talk about, just touch sort of and scratch the surface of the 5 topics I put in the box at the top. So we'll talk about warming temperatures, precipitation, coastal storms, sea level rise, and some conditions in the ocean. Okay, so there's one of those promised squiggles. It is getting warmer in Maine. We've observed about a 3.5 degree increase since the late 1800s. It's kind of hard, that has a lot of cascading impacts. It's sort of hard to imagine what that means in terms of the heat itself. But let's just say that, as someone who owns a business in Maine, as someone who cares for other people in Maine, heat is already having an impact. This is an image showing heat-related ER visits by county over the last couple of years. And it's not super common, but it is happening. As we look to the future, we're expecting an additional 2 to 4 degrees of increase in temperature by 2050, up to 10 degrees by 2100. In addition to thinking of this because of heat illness, as a business owner, you should be aware of increasing cooling costs. If you're in the food business, changes to the growing season, things like snow and ice cover, if that affects your industry. Don't want to just say the problem. I'll talk a little bit about some of the solutions that have come out of the Climate Action Plan. One thing Maine is doing is supporting installation of heat pumps. They have a very ambitious goal of 275,000 new heat pump installations by 2027, and we're well on our way. It is also getting wetter. And again, squiggle like this might not mean a whole lot. The way we actually experience the impacts of it getting wetter are more heavy precipitation events leading to images like we saw on the right there in the summer 2023 when there was a lot of rain in Maine. So each year so far we've observed on average a couple extra days where we have heavy 2-inch precipitation events. That's a lot of rain in one day, and 2 to 3 additional days of 1-inch precipitation events. So far, drought has not increased, but looking forward, we are expecting more extremes. So the dry periods to be drier, the wet periods to be wetter. That's just because as it gets warmer, the hydrologic cycle intensifies, which means that water moves faster and more of it moves between the ocean, the atmosphere, and land. What is something we are doing about it? A lot of the types of scenes you saw on that picture on the right is due to undersized culverts. So those are the crossings that water passes through underneath roads. And they're a really great group of engineers and other practitioners got together to put sort of climate projection consistent guidance for resizing culverts. And then Maine has put a lot of money into resizing these culverts. So here's just an example from Maine's Infrastructure Adaptation Fund, which put over $20 million into the state. A lot of that money went to resizing culverts. And sometimes if I turn it off and turn it on, it seems to work.
Let me know if you want me to advance it.
Great, okay. How about coastal storms? So these are the big winter nor'easters and sou'easters, also called extratropical cyclones we see in the winter. They are expected to bring more rain along with them, but we are unsure about changes in their frequency, how strong they are, and what sorts of tracks they will follow. I know it's often in the news that hurricanes, these are a different kind of coastal storm or cyclone, are getting stronger. They're becoming more frequent, more intense, kind of as a whole in the North Atlantic region. We don't know about specific impacts to Maine. Also, these storms don't have as much of an impact in Maine. By the time they get here, they're less strong because they have to travel over land and travel over cooler water, so they lose a lot of energy. So this is something that appears in the news a lot, but we are relatively resilient to it here in Maine. I know there's also quite a lot of interest in this idea of the sou'easter. So if you're not familiar, the three events that happened December 2023, January 10th, and January 13th of 2024, those were a little bit usual from the typical nor'easter we see, where a low pressure system kind of tracks over coastal waters and has air sort of swirl in from the northeast. In the sou'easter case, the track is farther inland, so you see that big L sitting over land, and that pulls up air from the southeast, which is a problem in Maine for two reasons. We're really exposed in that direction, so it churns up big waves, and it draws up warm, wet air from the south, so we see rain instead of snow, which can have all kinds of problems, especially like we saw in December. My lab is working with the National Weather Service to study these things, and the very first question we had three really bad ones back to back to back. Are these things new? Are they getting more common? And as a very first step, we just put together the first set of cyclones impacting Maine and categorized them by nor'easter and sou'easter. And just sort of the key take-home message here, this is the frequency of them per year from 1950 to present. And you might not be able to see all the way on the right beside this banner, but they're not getting more common. They are not new. We can expect to see them, continue expecting to see them in the future. Okay, but regardless of the characteristics of the storms themselves, they're gonna happen on top of higher sea level, and that means flooding is going to be more frequent and more severe. So let's start with observations. We've had a tide gauge sitting in Portland Harbor for over 100 years, which is really special if you're a scientist in Maine. And this is showing the annual measured sea level at that tide gauge from the early 1900s on the left to present. And there's that increasing trend we are all familiar with. Another thing to point out, there's this little spike that happened in 2023 and 2024, and that's a lot of what made the coastal flooding so severe during those sou'easters. Sea level was just higher than we'd ever seen. So this is about 8 inches of observed sea level rise since the early 1900s. And again, sort of in terms of impact, the kind of thing we actually see, maybe I won't push my luck and try to get this video to work, but can you advance the slide for me? Thanks. Okay, so that's the kind of effect we have seen from this sea level rise. So what this is doing, this is taking the figure from the last slide and condensing it all down into the bottom left-hand corner to give some context for what's to come. So if we look at this compared to projections, here is what the state is planning for. You notice two things here. Sea level gets higher. It gets higher faster. There's an acceleration in the rate of sea level rise, and the sort of range in the pink and blue, especially out towards 2150, is showing that we're uncertain about how much sea level will rise. I won't dive too much into the details here, but one thing that's very important to know is that acceleration and uncertainty comes from the fact that so far, The massive ice sheets sitting on top of the North Pole, Greenland, and the South Pole, East and West Antarctica, they've contributed relatively little to sea level rise so far. Most of the sea level rise we could experience in the future comes from these massive ice sheets becoming unstable. We are uncertain whether they will become unstable, and if they do, how fast that happens. So, but this is something, the uncertainty on this is significantly narrowing. Shameless plug to continue funding science as we continue to observe these things and improve our ability to model their response to warming. So expect that the next time the Climate Action Plan comes out in a few years, hopefully this band will be narrower. Okay, so what are we doing about it? There's a lot of money flowing through Maine to make us more ready for the impacts of sea level rise. So some of you might be familiar with LD1, which put $36.6 million towards things like home resilience, disaster management, disaster recovery, and flood modeling. State also received a $69 million grant from NOAA to do similar things, build community resilience, focus on working waterfront resilience. So there's good stuff happening. Okay, last thing I'll just touch on is that the Gulf of Maine is warming. How many of you have heard the stat, the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 97% of the world's oceans? Yeah, so this is showing basically everywhere that it's red, we're in a state of a marine heat wave. So meaning it is warm compared to what we observe on average. What you'll see here is just a lot of red at the top, and that is indicating we are in pretty much a constant state of heat wave now. What does that actually mean? Among other things, warmer water alters the base of the food web, making the food source kind of less energetic. That has cascading impacts up through the food chain, including on iconic species like cod and lobster. And so we've already observed shifts in species ranges and abundances. In the future, no surprise, we're expected to see continued warming. And another thing we're keeping an eye on is ocean acidification. So water becoming more acidic as it absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And kind of a particular impact to keep an eye on is conditions may be unfavorable for shell growth for most of the year by 2050. Okay, what are some things we're doing about it? Species going out mean new species come in, and there's a lot of research to monitor emerging species that might help make Maine's fisheries more resilient to climate change. So I just pulled an example from Management Conservation Sciences, who's monitoring the emergence of blue crabs in the Gulf of Maine, which if you've been here for a long time, probably seems shocking that you'd see them around here. Okay. I promised you some homework, so let's take 30 seconds, and what I want you all to do, this is a 250-page report again, and it's constructed by some of the best scientists in the country in these fields. So take a moment, read through this list, and give yourself some homework. Pick one topic, I didn't cover all of them, that you want to read more about when you go home. Okay, do you all have your homework for when you leave here? Cool. And that is all I got. Thank you.